Okay, let's get going. Welcome everyone to another SDEC session. And for those of you in the US, welcome back after a holiday. For those of you who had a holiday yesterday. Um, Today, we are going to be talking about how effective is your marketing strategy. And we're going to have Cara from Snowplow Analytics as our presenter. For those of you who are new to the SDEC, my name is Adam Greco, and this is a free community that we host to offer education around a number of topics related to digital analytics and digital marketing. This session will go about 45 minutes and it will be recorded if you want to share it with any coworkers later. I'm going to be putting in the chat information on how to join the SDEC if you are not currently a member. Again, it's free and just takes a couple minutes to sign up. I also am going to be posting a link for those of you who are SDEC members but have not joined the SDEC Slack group. Just as a reminder, the Slack group is where we share all of the recordings, and we have nearing about 50 recordings so far. So if you haven't joined the Slack group, we have about 2/3 of the folks are in the Slack group. I'm going to put a convenient link in there. And if you're not in the SDEC, all I do is I ask that you join first and then you join the Slack group after that. If you have any technical issues, I will be monitoring the chat. And as Cara is presenting, if you have any questions for her, please use the Zoom Q&A instead of the chat. So I think that is all of the housekeeping. So with that, Cara, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks. And also for me, welcome everyone, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So as Adam said already, today we'll be talking about marketing analytics and using data-driven solutions to evaluate the effectiveness of your marketing strategies. So before we dive into that, I'll just do a quick introduction. So my name is Cara. I currently work as a product manager at Snowplow, and I focus on our tooling that empowers our customers to use to execute on their data use cases. A big one, obviously, being marketing data use cases, things like marketing attribution and marketing analytics, marketing automation. Previously, I led Snowplow's implementation engineering team. So I've spent a few years working with our customers on designing and implementing tracking and data models. And so really have seen a lot of these use cases, and specifically have seen a lot of different companies implement different data-driven strategies to their marketing over the years. I'll give a quick overview of what Snowplow is, and then that's the last time I'll mention Snowplow today. This presentation is not at all about Snowplow. I just thought it might be interesting for you guys to know where I come from and what I do day to day, so that you can kind of put into context some of the things I say, and maybe also challenge at the end in the Q&A if you maybe are using different tools in your organization, have a different perspective. I'd love to dive deeper into that and discuss that at the end. And so just really brief overview, what is Snowplow? Snowplow is a data delivery platform. So we enable companies to collect and operationalize data from various platforms and channels. And really, companies use it to meet all sorts of different use cases, obviously marketing analytics being a common one, but we also see a lot of product analytics, building out a single customer view, even DevOps use cases, etc. So anything really is possible where you need to collect behavioral data. So obviously we spend a lot of time helping our customers thinking about how they can use this behavioral data to make a difference to their business. And that's really what I'll be focusing on today. So quick agenda. So first, I'll do a brief introduction to marketing attribution. I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with this already, so I won't dwell on this too long. But then I will make the case. I will argue why I think custom attribution is better and what can be gained from spending a bit more time and building out your own attribution solutions. I'll then dive a little bit into getting started with SQL modeling and basically building out your own attribution model. I won't go into too much detail. This is not a tutorial on how to build an attribution model, but it's more trying to give you a flavor of how you can approach this and why actually it might be a bit simpler than it may initially seem, and how that can be helpful. And then we'll look at some advanced attribution methods and how they can really give you a fuller picture of all of your marketing activities and how they might benefit your business. Cool. So without further ado, let's dive in. So a quick introduction to marketing attribution. So what is marketing attribution? Really, it's just the process of assigning credit for conversions to the different marketing touch points. And you might be lucky, you might work in an organization where the journey is very, very short, and people tend to, for example, purchase in a single session, and then this is a relatively straightforward task. But often, and most of you will probably work in businesses where the process for a prospect or a customer to find the end goal, whether that is buying a subscription or buying a product or engaging with you in any other way, is actually quite a complicated and long-winded process, as the example, for example, given here on the slide. And actually understanding how the different marketing activities that you are engaging in are driving those conversions can be a little bit complicated. And so that's where marketing attribution models come in handy. So there are many ways to do attribution. I've listed some of the very common ones. So for example, first touch, where all the credit goes to the first marketing touch preceding a conversion, last touch, same but last. You might exclude direct touches and do last non-direct touch. You might say you want to attribute all the different touch points across a user journey linearly. You might say the first one and the last one are kind of crucial, and then everything in between gets less credit. You can decay the value of a marketing touch over time. Really, there's endless different ways to attribute the different markets, the conversion that a user has at the end to the various marketing touches they have previously. Different ones will give different outcomes, but fundamentally, they're all trying to do a similar thing. And really, looking across all of these different ways to do attribution, the key is that you need to capture all marketing touch points and all conversions. So you need all of the data to be able to know exactly what marketing touches did a single user have across their journey, and then what conversions did they have, one or many, again, linking, and then you need to be able to assign both of those to an individual user. So it's no good having all of the touches and all of the conversions. You need to be able to tie them to a user so that you can map them together and understand on a user by user basis how are the different marketing activities driving the result, driving the conversion at the end. And so obviously any model has limitations, and actually marketing attribution models have received a fair bit of criticism over the years. And I think that's really any model that aims to quantify the impact of some activity on user behavior will be limiting. So for example, the classic limitations of marketing attribution models would be, what's the value of branding? You spend a lot on branding, or if you have a good brand, how do you take that into account when you evaluate your marketing activities? The other thing is, like, what customer activity happened because of marketing activity rather than regardless of it. So for example, if you're spending a lot on search, how much of those people would have found you anyway through organic searches, and how often are you actually engaging marketing activities that are not necessarily impacting the customer activity directly? And so really the question then becomes, if we know these limitations, then how can they be addressed, and how can we make sure that when we use these types of tools, we're using them appropriately given the limitations? And so that's really where the argument for custom attribution comes in. And so specifically, why does custom attribution address these limitations? So the first, and I think this is a really important point, is that owning your attribution modeling forces you to make any assumptions explicitly and deliberately. And this is really important when you're looking to understand the limitations and understand how you're going to be able to use the outputs. So if you're making assumptions about your user journeys, about the way your users interact, you are aware of those assumptions, and you can take those assumptions into account when you're making decisions based on the outputs of these models. So for example, if you assume that if that's only the first touch is important, then you will know that, for example, a channel like email won't be very heavily featured because you've decided to only include the first touch, and by definition, kind of the email is an unlikely first touch because they have to first be in contact with you to give you their email address to then be marketed to. So you understand the limitation of the model and the output of the model because you made the assumption at the beginning. This is a very simple example, but you get the idea. And the second point is that if you're able to run multiple different attribution models in parallel, and not just the ones we're discussing now, but maybe also some of the more advanced method we'll discuss later, you'll then be able to see how the differences in modeling logic and the different approaches actually impact the outcomes. And so you're able to take that into account. And if you, for example, see that some models tend to overvalue some channels compared to others, then you're aware that when you're making your decisions, so you're deciding, for example, how to reallocate spend between different channels, you're aware that some of the, for example, benefit of one channel might actually be due to the logic of the specific model. And so you can take that into account and make sure you're not biasing your spending decisions there. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into the benefits of custom attribution. So the first one is that it's tailored to your business. So it's looking at your business and thinking about your customer journey rather than making generic assumptions. Brings me to the second point. It makes no assumptions on your behalf. So you're making all the assumptions. And then thirdly, it can evolve with your business. So as your business develops, as you maybe add new products or things change, your marketing attribution can evolve with that. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So the first one is tailored to your business. We all know there are fundamental differences between vertical and business models when considering kind of the way the user reaches a conversion. And you can account for these. So if you have a long sales cycle or a short sales cycle, if your sales cycle tends to involve lots of different platforms and channels versus all happening on one website or in one mobile app, you can account for this and you can build this into your attribution model. And as I already said, you can include all platforms and all channels. So for example, sometimes conversions happen offline, or sometimes part of the journey happens offline. If you know this, you can take this into account and you can build it into your model. So that's really, really key. You can also tailor the data and the insights to the different stakeholders in the business. So if you, for example, think about your CMO versus data scientists versus data engineers, different people trying to build different things based on this data, if you tailor your model to your needs, you're able to accommodate lots of different needs. So for example, if data scientists want more granular view into how different campaigns and channels are performing so that they can, for example, build models that can predict how different campaigns and different spending will impact your bottom line, that's very different data set that, for example, you would want to present a senior stakeholder in a dashboard where they can look every Monday morning how marketing spend is performing and what they might want to optimize. And the last and increasingly important point is that also you can decide how you're going to deal with user privacy measures and with privacy regulations. So if you're taking control of all of this, you can really look at exactly what information you're capturing about your users, how you're communicating that to your users, what flexibility you want to give your users in opting out of these things, and how you're going to comply with regulations. So every kind of product or analytics setup that requires granular user data obviously needs to make sure that you have all the required consent and you understand what you can and can't capture about your users. So having those fine-grained controls is again key, and especially with something like marketing where you are directly interacting with your customers, it's all about understanding what benefits you're providing to the customers, communicating those clearly, and then hopefully receiving the required consent to do this in more advanced ways. Secondly, no assumptions are made on your behalf. So the first, obviously, data is not sampled. If you're building this all out yourself, you know exactly what data goes in and what data doesn't go in, and what data is being used when you're making your decisions. There's also no black box logic. So if you're going to build your own attribution model, you know exactly what you're counting as a user. So for example, are you using a cookie ID? Are you using an identifier that users have to provide when they interact with your product or service? What are you counting as user, and what assumptions are you making when you're stitching users together across different platforms, for example? Then also how marketing channels defined. So you're going with classic definitions, or do you have special marketing activities that are very specific to your sector or to your business model that you might want to classify separately? So you get to fully decide how you classify your marketing channels and how specific or general you want to make them. You can also decide things, for example, after what time period will a conversion no longer be attributed. So a lot of out-of-the-box models, for example, in GA360, etc., they make assumptions as to for how long a conversion will still count towards marketing touches earlier. But like those assumptions you can make yourself. So you might say, actually, we have really long sales cycle. Let's say you're a company that sells cars, or you're a real estate website. You might have really, really long sales cycles. And so you might not want to have conversions expire in a way after 6 months. So that's another thing that you might want to decide for yourself. So as you can see, lots of different things that you might want to tweak and you might want to decide how you use. And then lastly, it can evolve with your business. So you can update your logic whenever you like, and also you can apply it to all historic data. And that's often a really important part, and that's often a very limiting factor for analytics teams, is if you have systems that kind of lock you into one way of doing something, one set of logic, one set of attribution, and then you change your mind later because, for example, you start engaging in new marketing activities that create a new marketing channel, or you actually learn something new about your customer journeys that mean an attribution model that you previously used doesn't seem feasible anymore. Then you want to be able to change your logic, but you don't want to have a weird cutoff in your report where anything going forward is different logic to what you had before. So this ability to take your data model and run it over all of your historic data again, and for example, compare the outputs of the two different models, and then also use the same logic going forward than you have previously, that's really valuable to make sure that everyone's aligned on where you're heading and what the data means. And that means also you can build out more sophisticated solutions over time. So, for example, you can take more advanced approaches as you learn more, and then you can also work towards doing more intelligent marketing automations in the future. So, for example, targeting people specifically based on activities that you've observed in people that successfully convert, and then trying to drive those activities in people that haven't yet converted and that haven't yet engaged in those activities. So being able to have all this data and iterate on it as you learn more is really, really key. So that's kind of an overview of why I think building out attribution can be something worth tackling, and really approaching this from kind of building it out from first principles can be really, really valuable to your business, not just because it actually gives you with more flexibility and provides you with more modeling, but also because it forces you to go through all of those steps and really understand, how are users moving through my website, my mobile app, any other digital products I have. What assumptions am I making about them? Are those assumptions valid? Can I test those assumptions with the data that I have? And then what decisions do I want to make based on this data? And what does that mean for my marketing spend, my marketing automation, etc. So hopefully that will make sense. As Adam said at the beginning, if you have any questions about what I've said already, pop them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. So then let's move on to diving a bit into how this actually works in practice, because maybe it all sounds great, but also probably sounds a little bit complicated. So really the building blocks of getting started are quite simple. So you need the data, you need all the marketing touch points and all the conversions. Sounds simple, actually often the trickiest part. Then you need a SQL model, or you can also build this out in alternative languages, but this is often the simplest and easiest way to get started to attribute conversions to the marketing channels. As I will show you, this is actually a really simple part and often can be done quite quickly. And then you need a visualization tool. So you need somewhere where you can visualize all this data. And that's especially important if you want to socialize this across the organization, if you really want to empower different stakeholders in the organization to use this data to make their decisions. So actually the visualization and the socialization are often the important part in making this all successful. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. So what data do we actually need? As I said already, we need all the marketing touch points across all platforms and channels. So on web, you want to be capturing all of the UTM parameters and the referrers for all the sessions and page views that people have. On mobile, you want deep links, and there's specific mobile attribution solutions that get you this data in granular detail, and also let you export this data from these tools into your data warehouse, so that you can join it with, for example, if you have a website and a mobile app, you can put those two things together. Wherever possible, you also want to grab ad impressions and clicks. So you really want to be able to see how people are engaging with you on any offsite marketing activities. Obviously, you want to capture any emails you're sending, whether people opening them and clicking on them, and really any other information related to marketing activities. So in a pre-COVID world, if you had any events like conferences or anything like this, obviously you want to capture that as well. Or obviously the more offline the marketing activities get, the harder it is to capture that data, but wherever possible, grab it and add it in. You then want to capture all conversions, again, ideally online and offline. So you might have some conversions that happen online that you capture in your front end tracking. You might also have some things that happen offline that you have in a transactional database, though, that you can include. And as long as you have a user identifier across both of those, it doesn't really matter whether that conversion happens online or offline. So for example, if you have a website where people learn about a product, but then they have to call up to make an order, or they have to go into a physical location to buy the thing, as long as you log that and you have a user identifier that you can tie back to something that you have on the web, then that should work too. And so that's really that last point. It's really, really crucial to have common user identifiers with the marketing touch points and the conversions. And sometimes you can engineer processes to make sure you have those. So for example, if you're a car manufacturer and people learn about cars online and they spend a lot of time learning, kind of researching online before they commit. If you have then a cookie ID with all of that research, and then they come into one of the outlets and actually purchase a car there, what we've seen companies do, for example, is send them a confirmation email afterwards that takes them through to confirm something back on their website, so that they have that match between the person that bought something in the outlet and the online cookie ID. That's the kind of thing you might need to investigate whether you need to do to make sure that you have those common user identifiers across the marketing touchpoints and conversions. Again, that is a little bit more work, but it gives you that whole other level of understanding around how your marketing activities are performing, rather than just the typical, like, we've had this many sessions from this channel, which doesn't really tell you anything about the quality of those leads or how they will be performing later on. So just to give you an example from our own website, so Snowplow obviously being a B2B SaaS product, we have a relatively long sales cycle. We interact with our prospects across many different platforms and channels. And we often also interact with multiple people from a single organization. And so our marketing and sales journey for our prospects is very complicated. We interact with people on our website, we interact with them on social channels, mainly LinkedIn and Twitter. We have email newsletters, we do webinars, we have our GitHub open source estate, we have a discourse, we have a massive doc site, and then obviously we have our sales team that use Salesforce and other tools, and then we have most recently launched a free trial of our product as well that people can explore, and we get data from that. So we have all this data from all these different places, and all of that concerns prospects, often multiple of them within a single organization. And so we have to capture all of that information and make sure that from all of these different places, we have user identifiers. So for example, on our website, we use our own tracking. Same on social, we obviously use the UTM parameters if people click through. From Salesforce, we ETL that data into our data warehouse. For our email newsletters, we get the information from our email system and also ETL that into our warehouse. So we pull the data out of all of these systems and unify it in our data warehouse to have that log of all of the different marketing touch points and all of the different conversions that our prospects have. Just to give you an example of what it looks like for us as an organization. Different business probably will look very, very different. So then the model, I'm not going to try and go through some pseudo SQL on slides, but I just wanted to kind of walk you through the logical steps really briefly. Not expecting anyone to follow this in detail, but just more so that you actually see how this bit is, while it might seem the most complicated, is actually the most easy, because once you have all of this data, it just becomes a mapping exercise, really. So really what you want to do conceptually is you want to collect all of the marketing touches into a table, name it marketing touches, and you want to collect all the conversions into a table called conversions. And then you just want to add those all into one massive table, touches and conversions. If you then join that table on itself and only select the rows where the interaction occurred before the conversions, then you have all of the touches by conversions. So each touch will be multiplied as many times as there was a conversion afterwards. And then you just want to rank those so that for each conversion, you have the touches in order, first one first, second one second, etc. And you also want to record the maximum rank so that you can compare. For example, if you want to use the last touch, you can say, well, actually, if there was a maximum number of touches for this specific conversion of 5, then we're going to give all the credit to the 5th conversion. If you want to do first touch, you will always give all credit to the first. If you're doing bathtub, you will give 40% to the first, 40% to the 5th, and then 20% for all of the ones in between. So you need that maximum rank to be able to do that. And then you just compute the attribution scores. Then it just becomes a very simple mapping exercise. So as you can see, this is very few steps, and actually it's quite simple to build out. So really the tricky part is getting all the data in one place. Building the model is relatively simple. Deciding on your marketing channels is probably the most tricky part, as that can actually get quite complicated. And then it really is all about visualizing the data and making it available. So your model, you'll end up with a table which is one row per conversion and marketing touch combination with a score for each attribution model. So if that conversion and marketing touch happen to be the first for that specific conversion, you'll have a 1 here and you'll have a 0 in the last. However many touches you had, 1 divided by that will be the linear score, etc. So you can see the different scores, and then all you do is sum the scores by the channel, and then you have your marketing attribution scores, and you can make those classic visualizations that I've already had on my slides a few times with the pie charts. I know pie charts are very controversial. We can discuss about what's the best way to visualize this, but I do think they look quite pretty. But then again, I'm not a marketer, so not using this data day to day. So this is the simplest form of the model. Obviously, you might want to consider some additional things. So for example, you might want to start adding acquisition costs. So for example, grabbing from your click performance report, the cost per click for your Google ads, things like that. If possible, you might also want to add the revenue that you get from the conversion. So for example, if you're an e-commerce site, you want to add the order values. If you're a subscription business, you might want to calculate some sort of customer lifetime value and then attribute that. You might also want to split out attribution by additional dimensions. So for example, looking at device types or campaign information. Device types can often be interesting because, for example, we see that people tend to, for example, come from certain social channels more on mobile devices than they do on web, etc. So that might be an interesting thing to compare marketing activities across different device types or different campaigns or even different locations, whatever way you want to slice and dice this data. That's another benefit, obviously, of having this based on your own data in your own warehouse. You can add in those additional dimensions or different filters to make sure that you're really capturing the nuances of how people are behaving in different places. You then might also want to consider different types of conversions or even modeling intent to convert. So you might have signals on your website or in your app where people are showing you that they maybe are intending to convert, but they're not quite there yet. You might want to model that and actually give credit for that as well, because that might actually be instrumental in driving future behavior. And then, of course, you can also use different attribution logic to the simple types we've discussed so far, and we'll get to that next. But before we do that, we obviously need to talk about visualization. My beautiful pie charts back. So BI tools such as Tableau or Looker can sit directly on top of your data warehouse. So they're a really great option for visualizing this data. They also empower different stakeholders in the organization to explore the data at different levels of granularity. So you can build beautiful dashboards that give a high level summary, but then you can also let people kind of drill in and actually do these more lower level comparisons. So for example, looking at different device types or locations or other user features or user behavior features that they might want to compare and contrast across different channels and different attribution models. And if you empower people with these kinds of tools, you move away from these ad hoc analyses and static reports, and that really ensures that everyone is looking at the same data. So regardless of where in the organization they sit, they're getting the same results. And if, for example, someone in product is thinking about updating a feature and is worried that that might impact some aspect of the marketing or sales flow, then that they can go in and look at the numbers, and they can make sure that, for example, marketing performance hasn't dipped after they've changed something. And so that's really, really key. So that's my brief overview of how you can get started. Now let's quickly look at some advanced methods. So some of the advanced attribution methods that have come up in recent years are things like Markov chain modeling, where you analyze how the removal of a given touch point from the customer impact would affect the likelihood of conversion. So you're trying to infer the value of that individual touch point by saying, what would happen if we didn't have that touch point? Would we get the same outcome or not? And then there's the Shapley value, which calculates the average value of each channel's marginal contribution given all the possible channel combinations. So both of these go one step further than these simple models that we've discussed so far, in the sense that they don't think about the channels in isolation and try and contribute each channel's contribution, but they think about how those channels interact with each other to provide a certain outcome. And so obviously we know marketing touches aren't independent. So for example, if you see an ad somewhere and then a week later you come and search, probably the ad had some impact on you searching. Those two things are related. And so these types of more advanced methods really think about that interaction and aim to identify how valuable is a channel, not just in driving conversions itself, but helping other channels drive conversions. And so, for example, just to dive into what GA's 360's advanced attribution is, so actually from their documentation, if you read the details, you can see that it actually uses the Shapley value, which is a concept borrowed from cooperative game theory to provide their more in-depth analyses of exactly how the different channels perform. So let's look at how we might be able to build something like this out. So brief overview, as I already said, is a game theory concept for any economists on the call that aims to understand the impact of each player's contribution to a team by seeing how the players reach goals. So in the marketing attribution case, the channels are the players and the marketing touches. The different possible combinations of the marketing channels and the marketing touches are the team, and they're called coalitions. And then the conversions of the goals. So that's kind of the analogy we're going to use. And so how do you go about calculating this? Again, as you will see, this is actually quite simple to do. It's just following a few steps. So you calculate the conversion ratios. You try and understand how often each channel and how often each coalition or grouping of channels occur in the data set. So for example, do people tend to just search and then convert? Or do you often see that they have a social interaction and then they search and then they convert? So that interaction often occurs together. And then you basically have to map up the space of all the different possible combinations. So if you have 10 different marketing channels, you need to be able to say, well, you could have 1 and 2, you could have 1, 2, 3, etc. So you map out all the different possible combinations of the different channels. And then you calculate the worth of each coalition. So you basically take those, all the different possible coalitions and the number of times they occurred in the data set to understand like basically which ones are the more important ones, given the conversions we've observed in the past. And then you basically extract from that the marginal contribution of each channel. And so you basically say, well, given that these channels have worked together in these different ways, if we try and isolate, basically like reverse engineer the individual impact of the different channels, given how we've observed they interact with all the different other channels. Long story short, it provides a very different perspective on your marketing channel performance. And really what's the key here is that interactivity. So for example, a given channel, such as search, might look most effective. And so you might have this temptation to be like, well, why don't we pour all of our marketing budget into this single channel and just go all in on that? However, when you actually look at the interactions between different channels, you might discover that another channel, such as social or email or any other channel you're employing, is really instrumental in driving conversions. And so, for example, even if every user journey on average has 4 searches and only 1 other touch, if you remove that 1 other touch, the searches suddenly disappear. And actually, that 1 other touch is the thing that drives all of these other searches, that helps all of these other searches be successful. And so what the idea of this kind of method is to say, well, we can't pretend all of our channels are acting in isolation. We have to look at how they interact together. And actually, it might allow us to identify things that we would have, with a more simple approach, otherwise missed, and therefore directed budget away from things that are actually really instrumental in driving the overall user experience. And so hopefully this example, kind of comparing what we talked about initially with the more simple attribution models and then something like this, has showed you that evaluating marketing campaigns using different models and different techniques altogether is really, really key in making sure you're seeing the full picture and really giving all of the marketing activities you're doing the credit that they're due, and making sure that you're finding the right balance for your business and your user journeys. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cara. That was an amazing presentation. Tons of information. And this is a topic that I know we could probably talk about for hours or days. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and post them into the Q&A now. I will tell you that we have had a number of SDEC sessions related to one of the questions that we got already, which is wondering how attribution is going to be impacted or viable in a post-cookie era. So for those of you on the webinar, we have had a number of sessions around the changes that are happening in browsers and cookies. And this Thursday, we are going to have a session with Simo Ahava, where he's going to be talking about moving your tagging to server side to try to avoid some of the downsides of us living in a cookieless world. But I will, Cara, put it to you. How does most of what you talked about today change in a post-cookie era?
That's a very good question. And definitely, don't miss Simo's session on that. That would be very valuable. But I think one thing I would like to add is that what this will do, and in some platforms it will be unavoidable. So, for example, on web, you have this option of going server side. In mobile apps, for example, where you rely on third party providers such as Adjust or Branch or AppsFlyer to attribute what has happening, for example, in different social platforms where you're not able to track yourself, and like how they are sending people, for example, into the app store and then into your app. Um, that path will at some point go black. Like you will no longer, with some of the changes, for example, that Apple is making, you are no longer able to see how an individual user goes through that journey because Apple is not letting you see that. But in return, Apple is giving you an API that you can query and you can get aggregate information on smaller segments or cohorts. And so what I think might happen in the future is that instead of looking at individual users, we will be looking at individual groups of users that have similar characteristics or have behaved in similar ways, and almost looking at little pods and how they interact. And so what might happen is that we just move up a level. So instead of looking at individual users and individual cookie IDs, we'll have to look at user segments or user pods of similar characteristics, but then we can apply the same logic. And then actually a lot of the assumptions or a lot of what we've discussed today still applies, in the sense that you'll still need to think about, how do you want to attribute things? How do you want to define your marketing channels? And what different methods do you want to use to evaluate your activities?
Cool. Okay, so the questions are starting to pour in now. Next one, how have you been successful in aligning definitions of, say, leads versus prospects when different platforms and different teams might have their own definitions?
That's a very good question. I think two things. So the first is like having a session where you map different identifiers that you have in different systems, and kind of just try and develop a hierarchy and saying, well, this is the one, maybe like an internal ID that we have for a user once they've like signed up. That's the most important one. And then in this system, they're actually called this. And in this system, they're called this. You map that out. And as long as you have a map and you have all different stakeholders agreed that actually that mapping makes sense, then if you collect all of that data into one central system, you can apply that mapping and make sure that all of the systems that sit on top of that, so for example your BI tools, your automations, all consume that same mapping. But I think it's really, really key that you have that clarity and you have that written down. And people might say, oh, but we know what that the lead in this system means this in this other system. It's better to write it down. It's better to have that map. If you're in an office, put the map onto the wall and make sure that everyone knows exactly what it means, because that's like when everything falls down, is if different people think they're talking about the same thing, but they're actually talking about different things.
Okay, next question. What are examples of clients or industries you worked with that the advanced models made a significant impact on the marketing spend mix? And could this have been done without the advanced attribution? At what percent?
That's a good question. So I think yes, where we've seen companies with very complex journeys. So for example, I've worked with an auction house where like a lot of the conversions actually happen offline, and the conversions actually happen like it's a machine deciding who wins an auction, not the user purchasing. And so the way to attribute there is very, very complicated, and there's lots of different touches. And for example, estimating the value of a bid is much more difficult than estimating the value of someone buying something, because you know how much money they gave you, you know how much money you made. That's very clear. And so actually being able to see that nuance and build out a specific case that looks at all of that nuance made a massive difference than what they had previously, which was just basically doing a first touch attribution of saying wherever people came from when they became a lead, that's what we give them, and that's that. Um, the other thing I would say is that actually, once the hardest part of all of this is getting all the data in the right place. And so once you've done that, the incremental like effort of adding more different types of logic is very, very small. And so the every additional learning you'll get from that will be valuable. It's whether or not you make that first step of going off of a system like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics that provides nice logic for you out of the box and onto your own. That it really depends. If you're a product that, you know, people tend to buy it in one session, you only use the very standard marketing channels, maybe it's not so worth it for you. But if you have any sort of complexity in your user journey, we've seen huge gains, and we've seen massive shifts in how marketing is understood and what channels most of the budget goes to in those scenarios.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add to that is in my career, I've had some fun experimenting with just pulling back on certain advertising channels like paid search, maybe withdraw 50% of what we're normally doing and then seeing what the impact is. Because sometimes that separates the theory from what is real. And sometimes you can figure out where your point of diminishing returns is. Maybe spending 40% of what you normally do gets you, 80 to 90% the same number of leads, but saves you some money. So next question, have you extended this method to perform data-driven or machine learning-based attribution models?
So I mean, the if you, I didn't really talk in detail about how, for example, you would set up Markov chain modeling or the Shapley value. So they do use what you would call data-driven or machine learning approaches. So especially the Markov chain will be very hard to do in SQL, and you'd probably want to do in something like Python or PySpark and use the appropriate models. But again, I think I would stray away from focusing on like the technology that powers these outcomes. I think the most important thing and like why this approach is better is not the how sophisticated a logic you use, but the fact that it forces you to think about all of these things in more detail. It's the fact that it forces you to make these assumptions and to identify what you're actually trying to achieve and how you're going to use this data to make what decisions. I think that is the more valuable piece. And then actually which logic you use, it's important, and like you can use more fancy logic and it might give you that little bit of extra detail, but really that first process is where most of the value lies in my experience.
Okay, one last question. With increasing GDPR pressure on all sorts of user IDs, have you faced any troubles in building data warehouses or cross-referencing data recently?
Yes, of course, that's a challenge. So I think we've seen, at least with the companies we work, we've seen a shift away from certain third-party solutions towards more own data collection, just because that is, you can have much more finer controls. You can give people more options in your consent banners. We've seen also people move to anonymous tracking solutions, so capturing users anonymously, so not capturing any cookie identifiers and no IP addresses, just capturing the page views or the sessions, etc. they've had, to try and retain some information of what marketing touch points are being kind of experienced without necessarily be able to attribute them to a specific conversion. So we're definitely seeing changes there. I think the more flexibility you have around fine tuning those restrictions and managing consent, the more data you will be able to collect. If you just have to give a cookie banner that says accept third party or not, you're not giving yourself very many options. But if you could say, look, we have some third party tracking, but we also have some first party tracking that only we capture directly, we don't share with anyone else. And like there you have the options of being fully anonymous, anonymous between sessions, not anonymous, like all of this granular fine grained control. That often means that you can collect more data and then will make these methods more viable than if you have to kind of do these broad yes or no, black and white decisions.
Awesome. Okay, well, we do have a few more questions. So Cara's information is there. Please reach out to Cara if you want to go a little deeper on some of these topics. Thank you all so much for joining, but most of all, thank you, Cara, for spending some time and presenting on attribution. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, we'll see everyone at our next session. And again, cool session coming up on Thursday with Simo Ahava. Highly recommend it. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.